This is a story about bottled poetry. That's what Robert Louis Stevenson called wine, and it's something that many of us enjoy regularly, but also something that may be a good deal harder to get a hold of if President Trump follows through with the tariff threats he's made against the European Union.
We've been taken advantage of for many, many years by countries, both friend and foe, and frankly, the friends have been worse than the foes in many cases.
A new deadline and a new threat. The U.S. could impose a 30% tariff on imported wine from the European Union if no deal is struck by August 1st.
We have worked and now are ready to respond with countermeasures.
It's been a mess.
In New York, importer Victor Schwartz has spent nearly 40 years supplying restaurants and wine shops with hand-picked bottles from small European vineyards. Now, tariffs threaten to upend the business.
20%, then it was 10%, then they threatened 50%.
How different is the effect on your business of a 20 versus a 10?
I mean, in our industry, end of the day, we might make 5% as a net profit, 5 to 10%. So obviously, we can't afford 10%. We can't afford 20%, but 20% is really egregious. 20%, I mean, think about what that does. God, you know, it makes a $20 wine, you know, $25 basically, because, you know, there's kind of a multiplier effect as it goes through the system. You know, it's a much bigger impact. And don't forget, when we raise a price, it's not as if the consumer just accepts it.
Where do American customers for wine go if they decide the price is too high? I'm not going to buy that.
Where are you going to find Champagne? Where are you going to find Chateauneuf du Pape? Where are you going to find Chianti? You're not going to find it in Oregon or California. A Finger Lakes wine, let's just be clear, is nothing like a Napa Valley wine. Nothing like a wine from southern Italy or northern Italy or the center of Spain, etc. My gist is that these products are so connected to their place. And that's what's wonderful and interesting about wine. Otherwise, there'd be the wine company of the world, and it would come out of a spigot. Red, white, rosé, and sparkling. Done, right? But that's not why we love wine.
And Americans do love their wine. In 2023, we consumed just under 900 million gallons of it, more than any other country in the world, with a value of over $107 billion. More than a third of that is shipped in from abroad, making tariffs a real issue for importers. But those in the business say it's not just the imports that will be hit. It's the entire wine ecosystem. Ben Aniff is president of the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance. He has a shop in Tribeca that sells fine wine, which typically goes for over $20 per bottle.
Distributors and importers, even those, by the way, that represent U.S. domestic wines, about 75% of their revenue comes from imported wine. So that's one of the really interesting things about this. On the tariff front, all of the major domestic wine producing organizations, from Wine Institute to Napa Valley Vintners to Wine America, they're all against tariffs on imported wine because they understand their domestic growers, their producers, rely on healthy wine distributors for access to market.
Put another way, because state laws prevent domestic vineyards from supplying restaurants and wine shops, they need distributors. And the distributors rely critically on selling imports alongside their domestic wines. That's why those who import fine wines, like Victor Schwartz, and those who sell it to us, like Ben Aniff, have no doubt that tariffs will cripple their business, selling both foreign and domestic wines. But there's another part of the business, the value wine business, where a bottle or its equivalent typically costs less than $11. And producers for this segment, like Stuart Spencer in California's Central Valley, say they need protection from multinational companies bringing in cheap, subsidized imports that force American growers out of business.
There is a lot of what we call bulk wine coming in these big 20-foot bladder containers, and it is this bulk wine that is really undercutting California grape growers.
There's a lot of talk about the difference between free trade and fair trade. From your experience as a grower, but also from your dealing with Lodi, are there unfairnesses in some of the exports to the United States?
I mean, it's a completely unfair market. I mean, we are competing in a global marketplace. The European Union spends, over $2 billion a year between EU money and member state money propping up their wine sector. They are not only paying growers and vintners to distill excess wine and buy it up, but they're also paying them to plant new vineyards. And they spend hundreds of millions of dollars in market promotion all around the world, and the U.S. is the #1 target market. They also have trade barriers, so it gets really complex when you get in the weeds, but we are not playing on a level field.
Last year, California wineries, which make nearly 90% of U.S. wine, were stuck with more than 500,000 excess tons of grapes. Now, 77 million gallons of wine are sitting in storage tanks.
And you can still see some of the grapes on the vines from last year. We have thousands of acres of grapes that are being torn out right now. And we have small farms and family businesses that are up for sale because there's just not a prospect for them moving forward. My family's been in this for 50 years, and I talk to old timers that have been in it for multi-generations, and they've never seen it as challenging as we are now. 70% of all wine sales in this country is controlled by about a handful of 5 to 6 large multinational companies. They're bringing wine in bulk. They're blending it in with California wine up to 25% and calling it American appellation. It's a federal loophole. We have, millions of gallons filled up in tanks right now in California that don't have a home, but simultaneously 24 million gallons of bulk wine is poured into California, coming in at super low prices and undercutting the California grape grower.
Are you in favor of the tariffs that President Trump is talking about?
Well, I think if I was to speak to our 700 grape growers that I represent, I think many of them would support the tariffs to help level the playing field. And I think what we would really hope is that this would bring these other trading partners to the table to negotiate fair trade. The challenge we see with what's going on with a lot of the trade negotiations now is wine is just a pawn in a larger story, and the issues are about bigger issues. But I think none of us, want to see tariffs in place permanently. I think what we really want to see is really free and fair trade.
Some domestic producers, particularly in California, complain about unfairness from Europe because there are subsidies given to vineyards over in Europe. Are tariffs an effective way to deal with that problem?
I feel really bad for those guys, but a tariff is not going to solve their problem. Farmers that grow grapes to sell into, for instance, grocery store boxed wine, and that's terrific for them, and it's a great product for certain customers. The demand for those products is collapsing. People aren't buying bulk wine the way they used to.
Whether tariffs could give some relief to bulk wine producers or not, they certainly would have unintended effects on the American economy overall. You have spent some of your time down in Washington trying to explain to lawmakers, policymakers, exactly what this would mean for the wine business. What would you want them to understand that maybe they don't understand right now about the business and the effects of tariffs?
The United States has been talking about their concerns with respect to a trade deficit. We import more European wines than we sell American wines to Europe, but the reality is we have a huge economic surplus on the sale of European wines in the United States. We import about $5.3 billion worth of wine from the European Union into the United States. But American businesses make almost $23 billion from the sale of those products. Making a big margin on wine for a restaurant, it is not a luxury. It is an absolute necessity for their very survival.
If, in fact, tariffs do get imposed, what are the likely long-term effects on the wine business?
Contraction. And then you know what that means. Contraction means American businesses closing and firing all their employees.
What about the uncertainty itself, quite apart from the tariffs?
I mean, I'll tell you, I had phone calls from wine distributors who said, my grandfather started this business. We were in terrific shape and growing and hiring in January. And now I might have to decide if I'm going to close the doors in 2 weeks. When they're put into this position, when their choice is either to pay a tariff that they cannot afford, because these are small businesses, or don't bring in wine. Don't bring in the wine that represents 75% of the revenue for your next 3 or 6 months. We had restaurants from South Florida say, in the summertime, we need Sancerre and Rosé. That's what keeps our businesses alive. And there really is no substitute for these products.
One of our favorite Riojas.
So in your wine store, you have Bordeaux. If you can't get the Bordeaux, will the customer say, that's okay, I'll take the cab?
The answer flatly is no.
We talk about terroir. It's a word that gets bandied about. It sounds fancy, it's foreign, but it really, all it means, terroir, land, terre, it just means the place, right? It's just geography. Part of terroir is the human element, the culture, the civilization, the people who've been on this piece of land in southern Italy for multiple generations. They cook certain kinds of food, they make certain kinds of wine that go with those foods, and it's very specific, right? I mean, don't you love to drink an Italian wine when you're having your spaghetti and meat sauce?
Schwartz is trying to hold off the administration as the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit challenging the tariffs. The U.S. Court of International Trade ruled in his favor, but the appeals court stayed the injunction to give itself time to hear the case. If the tariffs go into effect for European wines August 1, how long will it take before we see it in our lives?
I think you'll start to see it pretty quickly. The first tariffed wines have only now started to come in. So distributors have still been selling through some wines that didn't have tariffs on them. You're going to start seeing those prices come now. You're going to start seeing a lot less choice. There are importers and distributors that have halted all of their shipments because they're not sure they can afford to bring them in. Now, at the same time, they have no substitutes for them. They're not buying more domestic wine, for instance. They can't afford to. They need to sell these European wines in order to buy more American wine. In a nutshell, American businesses are incredibly good at selling European wine, and they support huge numbers of jobs in the United States. Some of the most famous importers actually got into the business because they were in France or Italy during World War II, said, oh my God, I love this. This is what I want to do with my life. And they're classic American entrepreneurial success stories. As a matter of fact, many of the most famous European wines in the world, they're famous today because they were discovered by American wine importers. And they were brought back. They tasted 10,000 wines, said these three are the best, and they were right. Funny story, one of the first guys to do that, by the way, was Thomas Jefferson. He went to Burgundy, he bought Montrachet and Merceau Côte d'Or for he and George Washington. He bought Chateau d'Yquem for he and George Washington. And today, those are still some of the greatest wines on the planet. He had a pretty good palate, I think.
And now, ironically, Americans' affinity for European wines nurtured by the likes of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson may be challenged by the most recent occupant of their high office, and perhaps make it more difficult for us to enjoy that bottled poetry they discovered 250 years ago in fine French wines.
Cheers.